Of all the subjects we learned about in music, one of the most mystifying and confusing topics for many musicians is music theory. But does it have to be this way? Today we'll be discussing music theory and some mindset shifts you can take to open the world of theory up to your mind and ears and make it a more accessible and enjoyable experience. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Musicality Now. I'm Adam Liette, Operations Manager for Musical U, and I'm joined by the Musical U team for this Rewind episode. Now, if you've ever heard one of our Rewind episodes before, the team and I go back through our past interviews and share with you some of our favorite moments from the show. We'll include links to the previous Rewind episodes in the show notes as well. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of music theory, but perhaps not the way that you would expect. While there are a myriad of tips about theory that we've covered in great detail thus far on the show, this episode is all about the mindset that musicians should have when they are learning theory. Ask yourself, why should you learn music theory in the first place? And what are some of the approaches that will be helpful in making music theory part of your musicality, not just a disconnected subject that you study alongside your music practice? But before we go any further into this subject, I'll let the team introduce themselves. Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andrew Bishko. I'm the product manager at Musical U. I'm a longtime music educator and performer, and I play wind instruments and keyboard instruments, and soon I'm more instruments. I'm going to be adding some more. And I'm really happy to be here to talk about music theory.
Hello, I'm Stuart Hilton, and I am the community conductor at Musical U. Most of you know me inside the site as GTR STU 777, and I have probably chatted with most of you in there. Also, I am a, I guess you call a professional musician. I go out and play with a tribute artist who does Elton John, Billy Joel, and Rascal Flatts, and then also have another band on the side. So I'm looking forward to talking about all we are going to talk about, and that is it.
Fantastic. It's so awesome to have you guys with me again. We talk about these things so much just on chat and through Musical U, through the various discussion boards, but to get face to face and get to be able to share these things is always such a pleasure. So what we do, how this show works is we'll introduce a old interview from the show, and then we'll all talk about it and various things that we learned. And I know Andrew picked a particularly awesome interview that we'd like to start with. Andrew, why don't you kick us away?
All right, this is the Jeremy Burns and Matthew, I forget his last name, but they have a podcast themselves called Music 101. Is it Music Theory 101?
Music Student 101.
Music Student 101. And they're an interesting pair. One of them is like super conservatory educated, degreed master musician, and the other one, is basically coming from like a garage band background. They're both professional players and everything, but they are on a mission to make music theory more fun and more accessible and more purposeful and practical and useful for people.
Theory is not a set of rules. It's basically looking at, well, here's all this music that is come before us, and this is what is going on in this music, and it makes us feel this way. We like it for this reasons. Why is that? How does it do that? It's more of a process of discovery, and I think that if you understand that, it's easier to communicate that to other people. I try very hard not to slam down a set of rules and say, this is, this is how you write music. What I try to do is say, this is kind of the way music has worked up until now. There are exceptions to everything,
of course,
but this song that makes you feel really sad, or this song that it feels like it's moving forward to a conclusion in a way that songs I write or whatever may not be doing that. Well, there's a music principle reason for that. And I find that's easier for people to deal with. It's less intimidating to think, well, this is sort of like a secret thing I can discover than thinking, well, this is a whole lot of stuff I have to learn before I can consider myself an educated musician.
Okay, so first thing, there's a lot in there, but right before the beginning of this clip, he's talking about the rules, and mentions it in this clip too. Is that a lot of people think, when they think about music theory, they think about rules. Oh, you have to do it this way, and you have to do it that way. And he's saying it's not about the rules. It's about figuring out this is how the music feels, and this is what it feels like to me. Well, how did that happen? What was done musically to produce that feeling, to produce that emotion? So it's more of a description than it is rules, like, oh, you have to do it this way or you have to do it that way. That's what a lot of people get turned off to theory, because they think about rules. And when you're learning something specific, let's say you want to learn how to write a Bach 4-part chorale, or you want to learn about a certain jazz progression. Oh yeah, there are certain rules, but in a sense, it's not really rules in sort of like you do this or you don't do this. It's more like rules, like in the sense of a game. When you have a game and you're playing rules, the rules are what make the game fun, or what make the game work, what make it hold together. I watch my children with their friends, and it's interesting because they will say, okay, let's do this. Let's play this game. And they'll spend 20 minutes negotiating the rules of this game. And they have, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, this is going to be the rule, this is going to be the rule. They spend all this time negotiating what the game is going to be. Then they'll play the game for 3 minutes, and they're all happy and satisfied with how it came out. But it was all that rules, all this negotiation, and not in the sense of, of rules something where if you break the law, you're going to go to jail. It's more like rules of the game. Another way I like to look at the rules, it's more like the laws of nature. Okay. We all know there's something called gravity, and it's something that we work with, and we're not like, oh man, gravity, what a drag. It's just always pulling me down. We're like, yeah, gravity. Well, I can learn to jump higher, and I can learn to climb a tree, and I can learn to do this, or I can learn to lift up. I can always be working with gravity and playing with that. And that's kind of like what music theory is. It's like a law of nature. It's like how things are, and it's like, what are we going to do to play with that? How are we going to work with that? Communication is the other thing that he mentions. And I remember when in the 80s, when I was in this reggae band, and I was really stimulated. I wanted to write songs, and I would write these songs, and I would go back to the guys. Oh, it goes something like this. I want the bass to go boom, 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 and of course I couldn't sing either. So it was a combination of not being able to say, okay, guitar, these are the chords I want you to play. Bass, these are the notes I want you to play. I was trying to communicate with them, and it's like they were amazingly patient with me, and the songs came out good. But it was like, gosh, it was so tedious to try and get my ideas across, to get the things that I was thinking of and hearing in my mind, and to communicate them with other people. If I could have just gone in and said, hey, here's the chords, here's the notes, boom. And, now, because I know music theory, I can do that. I can just blam. I can even write out a score, or I can say, these are the chords, or, I want you to play this note or that note. And that's because of the music theory. So, that's why I went back for a music education. That's why I said, oh gosh, I really want to keep doing music, but I need to stop what I'm doing now, and I need to educate myself. I quit the band and I went to school. Gosh, it made a huge difference. So communication, being able to communicate with others, is the next thing. So the other thing I liked in his description is again, it's about how things work. It's not so much about what you have to do, but it's how it all works. It's like, okay, if I'm going to play, and it's even how things don't work too. It's like, if I'm going to play a note, if I'm going to be playing in one key and then, throw in some notes from another scale, it's like, okay, now I know why those notes don't work, or I know why those notes don't work and I like it that way. But it's also, it's like, how does this music feel? And how am I going to produce that feeling? And music theory gives me the tools to say, okay, if I want something to feel this way, I can do this in my music. I can use a minor chord here, or I can use this kind of a progression, or I can use a downward sequence, and I know what these things are now. And so it's like, I can produce that. And it's really cool to be able to know that. And it's having there be a principle behind what our experience and what our emotions are. So I love what he said at the end. It's like, this is a secret I can discover. This is about discovery. Music theory is about discovery. I can figure this out, and then I can use it, and that is like the wonderful thing about learning it. Now, I do want to add one thing about music theory that came to me as I was listening to this, and I don't know if it's addressed in another podcast episode, but when I was a child, I learned music theory in a class. I had a music theory class with a tuba player named Eric Benson, whose claim to fame was that he had written the Moog synthesizer part for the old TV Guide commercial. And I don't know if you remember that, Stu, but it was like one of the first commercials to use the Moog synthesizer, and he did that. Anyway, so I had this. He was a great guy, but everything we were doing, like, he would sit at the piano, and I would sit at the chair, and I'd be writing things on a piece of paper, and it all made sense to my mind. And then I went to my piano lessons, and my piano teacher was great. He was this Lithuanian guy, Jonas Svedas, classical pianist, great guy. And I was learning my piano, but he never talked about theory. And I always had such a rough time, like I would see a stack of notes and say, oh my gosh, I have to read each one of those stack of notes, the big black stack of notes. But if I understood theory, not just in my head about what it looked like on paper, but also what it looked like with my hands. And this is something I discovered when I started teaching. It's like, piano was always really hard for me when I was growing up. I learned it. I could play a good song, but it took me forever to learn songs. But when I started teaching like beginner pianos, and I started figuring out, oh, okay, if I know that this is the shape for this chord, and you guitar players know all about the shapes, but we don't talk about it in piano. This is a shape. This shape is this chord. It sounds like this chord. And if I move this shape, it's a different inversion. And getting the theory, not just where I could see it on a piece of paper, where I can hear it in my ears and feel it in my hands. Putting theory together in all those different ways. So a lot of times on Musical You, I do a lot of interaction with our members. And they say they're having trouble with something. And it's like, invariably, I would say like 95% of people who can't get something or are having trouble with something with ear training or with their music, it's because they're not doing it. They're just listening to tracks and doing the ear training and stuff like that, but they're not actually playing it on their instrument. They're not actually singing it with their voice. They're not actually doing it some way, doing it with their own body. And that is such an important component at taking music theory and making it real, making it work for you, is actually using it in what you're doing. So I want to add that to what we're saying about this great podcast from Matt and Jeremy. And I'm really excited that we're doing this, Adam, and that you put this together, because it's such an important thing, and it's so cool and so exciting. And most people are like, music theory, oh my gosh. There was that meme. I don't know if you posted that meme or some posted the meme. It's like, there's a music theory instructor, and he's like trying to teach this class, and the class is going, oh, and he says, come on, it's music theory. It's not rocket science. And then the next frame, you have the rocket science teacher. He's saying, come on, this is rocket science. It's not music theory. It's just like getting beyond that is what it's all about. Changing the mindset, as you talked about.
Andrew, you stole my joke. I was planning on telling that later in the show, and now I can't. But that's okay, because it's worth telling. And I love some of the things you said there, because it's so we tend to inflate this idea of theory as this is very serious work that we must very seriously work at and studiously attempt. And it's not that way at all. And I remember, gosh, we're going to get to John Hatcher. He's later on the show, but John Hatcher talks about his beginning days of playing when he was just in a garage band, right? And I remember starting that way too, 12, 13 years old, playing Nirvana cover songs in a garage. And it's like, hey, it's the power chord. That's all we played was power chords. And like a year later, I happened to have this older musician. He was like a junior in high school, and we ended up playing in a band together. Like, yeah, it's just the root 5 octave. I was like, wait, root 5 octave? What do you? And he like showed me the scale degrees. It's like, oh. And now that I'm a little more educated, I know, well, that's why it sounds good, because that's like some of the fundamentals of music right there. And that's why those chords sound great, and they sound great no matter what you're playing. You can't screw up when you're playing power chords, which is probably why all the rock stars play them, because you can't screw them up. But just that little insight when I was a kid, like, whoa. And it just opened up this whole other world to me. And there was this other moment where there's this band back in the late 90s called Korn. And they had this chord that they would play all the time. They called it the Mr. Bungle chord. I guess it's from a track called Faith by the band called Faith No More, Mr. Bungle. And it was one of the most awful sounding chords ever, because it was root, tritone, octave. So it sounded absolutely horrible. But like in the world of like heavy metal, it's like, yeah, this is great. This is what I'm talking about. And when you discover, well, that's why it sounds the way it sounds, it's because it's the tritone. And I just love this concept of playing, then learning from what you're playing. And just analogy, I mean, we talked about, gravity and all sorts of things, and how we don't get mad at these rules. And, right now in the United States where I live, it's the middle of baseball season, and everyone's nuts for baseball, and I am too. But when I'm teaching kids baseball, like, I don't teach them everything about baseball. I'm like, okay, guys, get to the plate. I'm going to pitch, you hit, run to first. And then once you figure out hitting, then I'm going to teach you about balls and strikes. Then we're going to learn how to steal. Then we're going to learn about the infield ground rule or infield fly rule. And it's through playing that we learn all of these rules. If you try to tackle all the rules at once, man, you're just going to go crazy. But learn through playing, learn by doing. It makes the whole experience so much more enjoyable and really, I think, more intuitive. It's like you play something, you realize it sounds good, you realize it works, and then you learn why it works. And that's kind of a cool way that I like to approach it even to this day.
Yeah, I was actually thinking when Andrew was talking and what you just said, I've always had the tendency to, I guess I would call it, walking in the exit door backwards when it comes to music, because I get things in my head, and I've talked to Andrew about this before. I'll get like some sort of music thing for the guitar, and it's going in my head, so I go and I work it out on the guitar. But then later, after that, then I can go look at the theory and go, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. And Andrew's even like, well, I think that is a G7 with a minus, but also you're doing a suspended right there, and it's kind of cool to hear how all that is working together. But it's kind of, I guess I would call it the sweet spot of being creative and also having the theory interrelated, because I've seen it go both ways where, I've known guys who are so theory related that they just stay there and they don't jump out of anything. Like, I can only write an original in 1/4/5. That's it. And I'm like, but you have the rest of the neck. You have all these different, chord forms that you could use, or you could try this. No. I must use this mode here. And I'm like, but then you also, on the flip side, you can have people that are so creative, they don't know what they're doing. So if they say, well, what did you just do there? Can you show me what you're doing? I forget. So yeah, there's that kind of like nice middle ground where everything kind of works, in a nice cohesive way. Yeah.
That's such a good point, Stu, because I know that a lot of times my music theory is a way of like, backtracking, like what you said, going through the exit door backwards. I'll be messing around on the piano or hear something and I'll mess with it. As like, I don't know what it is when I'm listening to it necessarily in my head, but then it's like, oh my gosh, that's what that is. That's a sus2 chord, or that's a thing, or there's a moving bass line underneath that, and I can describe it, and that way, I can write it down and I can remember it, or I can communicate it to other people. So that is so important. It's not just like theory comes from what we do, from the music that we make. It's like people make the music and then the theory like describes it. And yeah, theory can help us when we're creating music. It's like, sometimes you get stuck. It's like, okay, well, what scale am I in? What are my possible chords? It narrows down your choices, and you can say, okay, these are it narrows down my choices. I can choose from this and this. I can try this or that. Oh wait, that worked. That sounded better. So it's this constant thing going back between how it works, what it sounds like, and what in your head, and then what it sounds like, and trading off in those things. So it is this sort of dialogue with your understanding and with your experience. In terms of experience, Adam, you mentioned the Mr. Bungle chord, and so I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to experience it. So here you said it was the root, right? And the tritone. That's a tritone, the interval. Okay, and then the root again, right? Okay, so I'm sorry I don't have my distortion turned on to my keyboard, but that would sound awesome with some distortion, Anyway, so we just experienced Mr. Bungle, right? All right, so carry on.
Fantastic. Yeah, it requires a certain level of distortion and angst to make it work. But yeah, wonderful. Okay.
And proper look on your face.
The proper look on your face. That's how you look cool when you're playing the Mr. Bungle chord. Awesome. Well, let's move on. I have a sound clip from David Reed. So someone completely different. David Reed has this fantastic website called Improvise for Real. If you ever want to learn all about improvisation and so many different ways to approach it, I mean, David Reed is one of the best out there, and it's been wonderful getting to know him on the show and getting to just share things with him. And so I couldn't let this episode go without sharing this episode from David Reed.
I believe that creativity and a genuine understanding of music is the result of the student having the opportunity to get to know the raw materials of music firsthand. Okay, I think human beings learn best when we're able to explore the world directly and get to know the raw materials of our art, and when we make our own decisions, our own creative choices about how to use those materials. It's through that process that you actually learn to understand music. In other words, improvisation is not the result of 10 years of studying theory and learning what chords go with what other chords and what scales should be cobbled on top of those chords and so forth. Improvisation is actually activity that leads you to the understanding in the first place. If you think about the way we teach any other art form, for example, in a painting class, there might be some technique you learn. Maybe you're talking about, lighting effects or foreshortening or whatever, but then there's always this moment in the class that the teacher says, all right, class, now you're going to have an opportunity to make your own original painting, and you're going to choose the subject, and you're going to choose the composition, and we're going to practice this skill that we just learned.
I mean, so much goodness in that short little clip, right? And when I hear that, talking about experiencing the music, it brings me back. When I first really began studying theory, it was in my first year at the conservatory. So this was hardcore musicianship. It was counterpoint. It was very strict rules, going all the way back to early Gregorian chant. And it was so strict. And, the inner rock musician in me that I was, it didn't make any sense to me. And I was being taught these rules, and I was like, wait a minute, what do you mean parallel fists don't work? They're to be avoided. That's all I do, right? I play parallel fists. But I kept with it, and I kept experimenting and kept listening, kept learning. And I remember my aha moment, the point that turned everything else around, and it was the Wagner opera Tristan and Isolde. If you haven't heard this opera, I'll put a link in the show notes because it's worth it. The prelude is one of the most beautiful, haunting pieces of music in the entire literature, in my opinion. it starts with the root and goes to this minor sixth interval, which resolves into this chord. And it's just this beautiful chord. And to this day, it's known as the Tristan chord. Like how it resolves, how it works functionally, it's one of those things. Like theorists will debate how this chord actually works. So they just call it the Tristan chord. And for me, that opened up so many doors. It's like, whoa, I get it now. I get how this opens up so many things. It inspired years of songwriting. Years, just hearing how that minor sixth interval resolved into this chord and how it went from there, and how the melody progressed over time and the various little tricks Wagner was using. It opened up so many doors for me. And so if something doesn't work for you yet, if something isn't connecting yet, keep searching for your moment. Keep searching for that piece of music that will bring it out for you. We all have the music we're really seriously inspired from. Use that moment. And it's not that I didn't know theory before then. It's just, it hadn't been pulled out of me yet. And from there on, I was able to really see the forest for the trees, so to speak. And then David moved into talking about improvisation and how this transpires. And improvisation is something I work at. It's not something that comes necessarily naturally and easy for me still to this point. So I'm continuously working on it. But in my head, it all becomes easier when I simplify it and try things one at a time. So right now I'm just starting to play in a jazz combo again. And what I've started to do is the first time we go through a chart, it comes time for my solo, I focus on chord tones. Just improvise with the chord tones. And then I'll move into a pentatonic scale. And as I get more comfortable with the chart, more comfortable with the progression, more comfortable with the changes, then I'm able to experiment more. I'm able to use different passing tones, leading tones, blue notes. By the end of the day, it's this basic theory knowledge that allowed me to get there. And I'm trying to make sure my children don't have the feelings about improvisation that I do. So they're really in their introduction stages of piano. So I'm having them start improvise with just pentascales, which is really cool because it fits into their one hand. And they're having so much fun with it. And it takes me back to what we're seeing in the foundations course. We're just starting with something very simple. Hey, just improvise a rhythm. Take one note and do an improvisation on it. That's all it is. And just starting with that very basic thing, man, it just opens up doors. And I think sometimes we put things in our own way. We try to see it all at once, but just take what's right in front of you and just let it inspire you, let it move you. And I think you're going to be really surprised by what you find. And the great thing about this is it never ends. It never ends. You are always going to find new music, new things that just, they tug at your heartstrings. They get every synapse in your brain firing, and you want to discover why this works, why this moves you. And so it's this lifelong journey. And so when we talk about being a lifelong musician, that's where this clip really speaks to me. It's about that lifelong discovery.
Wonderful. I think that improvisation, like what you were saying, and what David Reed's whole thing is like, improvisation is not the end product of your learning. Like a lot of people think, and I see this on the site all the time, it's like, okay, well, once I get this ear training down, and once I get this theory down, and once I can do this and this and this, then I'll improvise. It's like improvise can be your companion and actually your mode of learning all the way through from the very beginning. And I'm so glad you're starting your children out that way, because it's like Matt and like Matt was saying, it's that process of discovery. You improv something, and if, let's say, okay, I want to learn how to do, one of the things I notice is that, like, when we learn scales, for example, scales, it's like, that's like, so when people think of theory, the first thing they think of is the scales. It's like running up those scales. Okay, so it's like, okay, you can run up and down the scale, and it's like, but what does that do for you? Like, do you ever see that in music? Okay, like, and sometimes in Mozart, you have these scale runs, but it's not really that common in music that people are just running up and down scales. So what are you going to do with that? And it's like, So, okay, I want to learn scale. Well, first of all, what if I do that scale from the top to the bottom instead? I go da 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 da. Oh my gosh, it's like a whole different thing. It sounds different. It does something different. And then you start playing around with the notes in that scale. Say, okay, I'm going to do an improvisation. I'm going to use the first 3 notes in that scale, and I'm going to use the second 3 notes. Or what if I, instead of thinking about the bottom note being C, I'm going to think about it being D instead of using the same notes, running up and down the scale. And you start to learn that scale inside out by improvising, by playing with it, by messing with it. Like there's this thing called modal theory, and people think of it as something really super advanced and really complicated. And it's like, my gosh, it's so easy and it's so fun. That's like where you take a scale, and instead of making like C the bottom note, you make D the bottom note in the C major scale. You're playing a Dorian mode. And my gosh, it's like, it just opens up a whole new area in that scale. And, and it's so much fun to do. And it's like the doing of it that makes it work. The doing of it, getting it in your hands and getting it and actually doing it, where you're improvising and making things up and you're exploring and you're discovering the theory and how it works for yourself. That's what brings it alive.
I will say that, I guess within the terms of improvisation, some of the bands, what we always love to do is write via improv. And that's like, normally it's like 3 of us. So there's like a bassist, a drummer, and me. But we always find some great stuff just by kind of improvising and getting into jams and just kind of winging it, and the worst part is normally we would get to the end and realize that we had never recorded anything that we had. So then we have to go back, what were we doing 2 minutes ago? So that was like the only thing, but it is that improv, it leads to great creative moments. That then, like you were discussing skills, and I was thinking about, a lot of times that, that's part of that whole theory thing is being able to go back, because sometimes I'll come up with some kind of bizarre rhythmical things, and I've got to go back and go, okay, what am I supposed to solo over this? Because there's got to be some skill going on, even though this seems like a bizarre key. But yeah, knowing that theory is the proper thing that makes it all come alive. Podcast on this subject that really seemed to speak to me and I could relate with was episode 160 with John Hatcher from the Blues Guitar Institute. He talked about the mix of flash or technique with also knowing the fundamentals of theory and putting it all together. And here's that clip.
I think what I teach at Blues Guitar Institute, I try to balance the technical stuff because it's fun. It really is. And you need it. You need it to pull off, certain things in great music. But I try to balance that with the theory, and kind of move together in lockstep and explain why. Because you can learn something out of a tab book, but that doesn't mean that you can recognize that in the next thing if you don't really understand it, and for me, it's just part of me having that framework of those basics, those fundamentals. It helps me recognize things. It helps me recognize patterns. It helps me learn things quicker. It helps me not feel like a complete idiot sometimes if I'm sitting in a jam circle. I'm like, I can at least get through this, So I don't know if that totally answers your question there, but I just think that this stuff is very important to learn, along with those crazy cool things from the tab books.
Fantastic.
So this the whole podcast was kind of it brought me it gave me a lot of flashbacks of my earlier years doing heavy metal, which I won't go back to what year that was. Anyway, we would have folks come out who would try out to be a second guitar lead, and they would come in and they would hit these solos and just nail them. I mean, there'd be note per note perfection. But then when it came to doing like the rhythm or having to play rhythm behind me doing the solo, they would get off. They weren't able to, number one, be able to sync with the bassist and the drummer. But also number two, if we said, okay, we're just going to improv here a little bit, they would kind of look at you like, what in the world is going on? So it seemed like they never got past, what he was saying, the tab books. They've like learned it and they're like perfect, but they can't go, they're kind of stuck in that place. Not that anything is wrong, but you got to go to that next step. It also happened, there was a guitar player back then I just had huge respect for. And he was just phenomenal guitarist. Even like they would write their own stuff. Great player. His technique was just, it was John Petrucci style technique. So he came out and he was watching the band I was with at the time. And we were like, oh man, you want to jam? We're going to do some blues. And he looks at me and he goes, I don't know how to do that. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't know how to do that? And he goes, I've never jammed. He goes, all the solos I do, I write out. And I'm like, really? So, and I was kind of blown away because I was like, number one, I was like, wow, he writes every solo out, perfectly, but he can't just kick into a jam session and, have fun with it. But, still, I've always had huge respect for what he did. So today I find knowing and having a decent idea of theory along with some technique and flash has helped me. I'm definitely not the flashiest guy you'll ever see. But I have learned the things that has gotten me gigs, in some good paying gigs, that has helped going along with also professional work ethic. So such as the shows I do with this tribute artist, we do Elton John, Billy Joel, and Rascal Flatts. When I first got in, he told me, oh, by the way, I do wardrobe changes during Elton John. So be prepared for longer than normal guitar solos. To which my jaw unhinged and fell over. And I thought, me? So, I needed to know how to improv and be able to actually develop it. And also what made it more interesting is this guy doesn't do band rehearsals. So to have that theory and know how to develop things, using improv, became a big thing for me. Because is knowing how that being able to use your ear, improv correctly, add rhythm and everything else. Because the other band I play in, I'm the only guitar. So when I do a solo, I have to make sure that I'm rhythmically correct too, and paying attention to that. Speaking about, improv, we have discussed this. We have a great improv roadmap that hits on all these things that we are talking about chord tones and using melody. And I have to say, even, I have learned from it, and it's been great as Andrew has put so much time and effort into those modules, but it has helped me, especially doing these longer abnormal guitar solos. And I appreciate that. But I always think, learning off tabs is great. It's fun. Sounds great on video and Facebook clips. But you also have to know the fundamentals of rhythm, how to phrase a solo, how to work it. Especially if you're called on to improv, knowing scales, knowing improv techniques like the roadmaps, knowing how to find the keys of songs, which was an issue in one point because when you're playing these guys who are all piano, finding the key of the song becomes a little sometimes trickier than a lot of other songs. So I've had to learn how to find that. Doing the chord progressions through when playing songs written by piano guys. Yeah, I just said that. But anyway, and I mentioned this earlier, it's finding that sweet spot of flash and technique, so to speak. Or we could say theory and fundamentals along with the flash. It can really make you a nice rounded musician that can go into different styles and really help your playing.
Stu, I think it's so cool what you're saying. And like my big takeaway from what you're saying is that theory makes things easier. Like a lot of times we think, that, oh my gosh, how am I going to learn that? It's going to be such a thing. So difficult to learn it. And we learned from what Adam was saying from David Reed, that it's not that hard to learn if you're doing it by exploring it, and improvisation is a great tool to explore it. And it's not that sort of out of this world. And then once you learn it, without your knowledge in music theory, doing those gigs would be like a nightmare, because you'd be like basically like stabbing in the dark on everything. That's what Matthew talks about. It's like this idea of stabbing in the dark, and where it's like, okay, well, that sounds really cool, but what is it, and then you just like goof around on your guitar until you figure out, okay, this sounds kind of right, but if it's like, okay, well, I know what this progression is, and I know what this is going to be. It narrows down my possibilities. And then you can do the kind of gigs that you're doing, like doing gigs where you're learning massive amounts of music in a very short amount of time and still having fun and enjoying it. It's like, it's one thing, like, for me too, it's like when I was growing up, it was always about learning that recital piece, And it was like, I would spend all year learning my recital piece. And then like the day after the recital, I'd kill it on the recital. Then I'd forget it the day after the recital and sit on, the next year's piece. And it's like, there's so much fun you can have with music, either creating music or learning music. And with just a little bit of theory and having the right mindset to learning that theory, it just makes things easier and funner. There's a word for you. I just improvised that word.
Speaking of funner, I have a funny story in relation. So the first time I play with this guy, and it's been a 3-year process doing these improvisations, and I'm learning and getting better at it. I'm still not, you're always feeling like, okay, I can still do better than what I just did. But anyway, the first time I did it, he already warned me. One song was Benny and the Jets. And so we hit it, and I've done like long solo things before, but this is like longer than anything I've ever done. So I go into it. I mean, I'm like feeling really good, and I feel like I'm building it. And I get to where I'm like, okay, I've got all my ideas done, and I look over and we're not done yet. And suddenly it hits me. I'm like, oh, shoot, now where? But it like hit me like, oh man, I got a lot more work to do because I'm out of ideas. But yeah, it definitely put me through my paces and still does.
You just need a DC Alfini then, right?
Yeah.
Now, Stu, you were talking about the guitar player who could play these solos note perfect and didn't know what he was doing, really. And I had the exact opposite experience, where I was like, I immediately jumped into Metallica, Dream Theater, all these really good guitar players, and I'm like this kid on this little Stratocaster, and I couldn't play them. I was like, trying to play things note perfect, note by note on these tablatures, it didn't work for me until I discovered pentatonic scales. And I discovered these boxes that all these other guitar players were working on throughout the fretboard. And suddenly the fretboard became alive for me. I could see the fretboard in this 3-dimensional. I was like, whoa. So not only could I learn solos way quicker than I ever could before, I could see things, I could see where they were going, I could see how they were moving in and out of the different inversions of the scale. I could also improvise more. And best of all, and this is just the 14-year-old in me, everyone thought I was amazing. Like, how are you doing that? Well, it's just this scale, and I didn't want to tell them. I don't want to give up my secrets because it was earning me gigs. But it was just that very basic understanding of theory that just opened up all these doors, tons of gigs, and it's cool how we have this fundamental thing and we all kind of come at it from these different angles. And I think that's healthy. And as teachers, as musicians ourselves who are talking to other musicians, we should encourage that exploration. Hey, that didn't work for you, try this. That didn't work for you, try this. Like, there's so many different ways to come at it. And there's no right way to learn this stuff. There's your way and whatever works the best for you.
Yep, very much agreed. And it, yeah, I mean, luckily this guy, the guy I play for, he does let you explore, but he will also tell you if you may have gone too far. So I actually did that. We did the song Rocket Man, and I came up with this ingenious idea to use the delay pedal as part of an effect for the solo. And and if you hold it, it does this like little thing where it takes your notes and it goes dee kind of up and then back down. And so I kind of warned him first, and then at the end he was like, I said, so what'd you think of that? And he's like, it may be a little too much. But, at least he was cool, and he let me kind of, experiment with it a little bit. Because I thought it kind of sounded like a rocket taking off and going up into outer space. But maybe only once it should do that, not 5 times.
I love talking about this stuff. I love being with you guys. And and it's really cool. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Fantastic. I have to admit that this mindset is not something that was in place when I first started learning theory at the university level. And I remember being very frustrated by learning all these rules and guidelines that seemed completely disconnected from the music that I was playing, especially the popular music. And this is something I've heard from Musical U members, from followers on our Facebook posts, from just people I meet on the internet. And as Andrew reminded us, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. At the end of the day, music theory is simply a way of explaining what is occurring in the music that we are playing. But the music came first. Music theory was born out of the way that composers and musicians were creating music. You can almost say that it's as simple as defining best practices, rather than a strict definition of rules that you must follow. I would encourage listeners to start with the music they love and learn how it is put together. These abstract rules like a Picardy third, a tritone, or secondary dominant make a lot more sense when you hear them first. My final thought is the argument that we hear so often that certain musicians never learned music theory, so why should you? I would argue that while popular musicians like the Beatles, Metallica, and even Jimi Hendrix may have never learned what a particular musical trick was called in theory, they certainly understood how it made sense in their songwriting. And if you were to sit these musicians down and give them the technical word for what they were doing, they would certainly understand, because they already understood how it worked through their listening and their musical ears. I hope these approaches are a good jumping off point for you and encourage you to dive into a better understanding of music theory, exploring this wide world of music that surrounds us. A big thanks to Andrew and Stu from the Musical U team for joining me on this Rewind episode. It's always fun talking about these subjects. Until next time, thanks for watching Musicality Now.
Oh hey, one more thing. If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to like it on YouTube, and if you haven't already, please also subscribe to our channel there. That's going to help make sure you get all our latest videos as soon as they come out, and it also helps us reach more people, which means more episodes, better guests, and everybody wins. So please take a second to like this video and hit subscribe.